Okay, another large-scale uh, revolt that happened in the North American colonies was the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 against the Spanish colonists. So essentially what was happening here was that the Pueblo and the Spanish had lived in kind of uh, a tense situation, but tolerating each other between the 16 teens and 1680. Things started to get worse in the 1660s, though, as there was a drought. Food supplies dwindled. The population of the Pueblo dwindled. They lost quite a lot of people, about 30% in about 10 years between the 1660s and 1670s due to disease and food availability. And the Spanish in the 1670s engaged a policy of repression against a Pueblo religious movement that was encouraging Pueblo to reject Christianity. A good number of them had converted to Catholicism, or at least were going through the motions of Catholicism. So the Pueblos became very angry about that repression, and some of the repression involved capturing the revival leaders and torturing them. Two people that were tortured included a man named El Saca, who was the Pueblo leader in Taos, and Popé. And both of them were arrested and then tortured and then released. In 1680, a few years after his release, Popé had a vision in which he said he saw three figures who were emitting fire from their extremities and told him that he needed to plan a revolt in which they would attack the local colonists all on the same day, and he was to make a knotted cord of a local plant called maque, and the number of knots in the cord would signify the day in which the Pueblos were supposed to attack. And so that attack came on August 10th of 1680, and they attacked and killed all but two colonists in Taos, and then marched to Santa Fe, summoning all the other Pueblo natives, and surrounded the colonial buildings. About 2,500 natives surrounded the around 1,500 colonists that lived in the colonial buildings, and basically said, "You've got to go." So there was some fighting. And they attacked the governor's mansion itself, and including wounding the governor, and said, "We're settling here now." And after the fighting was over, they let the survivors go, including most of the women and children, and they fled south to El Paso. So let me show you here where this was happening. So here's the New Mexico colony. There's El Paso. Here's Santa Fe right there. And what the Pueblo are facing, like I said, all those droughts, and they were also facing attacks from other natives, where these red arrows are pointing for. These are the roads in between the Spanish colonies, and these are where all the Pueblo lived. And the Spanish colonists were separate from the troops, so there were troops spread all around. They were scattered, though, and that's one reason why the revolt was so successful, because the troops were all over the place. What ended up happening was that the Pueblo successfully pushed the Spanish colonists out of Santa Fe, forced them to abandon it and retreat back to El Paso, where they did not return for 12 years. And over those 12 years, the Pueblo, for the first 3 or 4 years, were doing okay, but then they started dealing with these attacks from the Apache and the Comanche and the Utes again, and started to lose control over their internal operations. So by the late 1680s, early 1690s, the Spanish thought they could successfully return. A new governor went to Santa Fe and tried a different tactic than the previous one. His plan was to ally with some of the Pueblo and promise them that he would make them chiefs. And that worked pretty well. By 1693, there were enough Pueblo who accepted the Spanish back that they were able to reestablish kind of nominal control. The new relationship, though, was different than the old one. The Pueblo simultaneously cooperated with the Spanish while controlling their own communities in a way that anthropologists termed compartmentalization. And that meant controlling their own affairs, particularly their religion and their ceremonies, but nominally recognizing the Spanish as being in control of the entire area. So during the 18th century, the Spanish colonists and the Pueblo increasingly lived more like one another. They started to mix more. The Pueblo became more like the Spanish, and the Spanish became more like the Pueblo, and they kind of learned to live and let live somewhat. And so there was a less exploitative relationship out of necessity that continued well into the 18th century. There were still some other conflicts. The Spanish fought with the Hopi, for example, on the periphery of New Mexico. But this was the best example at the time of natives successfully pushing out Europeans. Rarely did native revolts actually succeed in ending European control for any significant amount of time once they showed up. And this one actually did. There were 12 years where the Spanish were completely gone from Santa Fe. And then even when they came back, there were new accommodations that had to be made.